Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am very happy to have David Marchick on the podcast. David is the Dean of the Kogard School of Business at American University. He's also been a teacher there. He's been a professor. He's also served as Chief Operating Officer of the United States Development Finance Corporation and the Biden administration. He's also been at the Center for Presidential Transition, which is what we discuss. He's also been in the private sector. He's done many things. He also served in the Clinton administration for over a 7-year period as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Transportation Affairs, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Trade Policy at the State Department, and Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Trade Development. He's also served in the White House and worked on NAFTA and WTO agreements and at the Office of the U.S. Trade as well. He holds a law degree from George Washington University, master's in public affairs from the LBJ School of Public Affairs, University of Texas at Austin. So he's quite the resume. He has quite the resume, and it definitely shows in the conversation. He is a wealth of knowledge and just a wonderful person. We talk about his podcast that he did and the book called The Peaceful Transition of Power, an Oral History of Presidential Transitions, which he basically took the conversations he had with many people in government, people like Baker and people that have served in all these different administrations, I think going back to the Carter administration up until the current Biden administration, and talked about presidential transitions. Obviously, this became very much at the forefront of people's minds during the last presidential transition. And the book is really good. It's very readable, and it almost feels like a kind of really important document of sorts of understanding why transitions are important in the modern sense over the past 50 plus years. And so it's very good. And we had a really wonderful conversation about it. We talk about the podcast and how the book came about and what the whole origins of this was. We talk about what's incorporated in presidential transitions and what that's about. We talk about 5 major lessons of presidential transitions. Talk about the importance of the Office of Presidential Personnel and the General Services Administration. We talk about how national security briefings work during a transition between the outgoing president and the president-elect. We talk about some 4 key features of leading in a crisis with historical examples. And then we spend some time talking about kind of some of the specific administrations. We talk about how President Carter was kind of the first modern president to do transition planning. We talk about how President Reagan ran a pretty good transition. We also talk about Mitt Romney and what happens when people start a transition team and then they don't win, and what happens there. That's very fascinating. And I think Romney is a very good example of how organized they were, even though it didn't work out for Romney. We talk about more recently Chris Liddell, how he was very essential for the transition from Trump to Biden. Really fascinating. And then we talk about presidential transitions in the future. So it was absolutely wonderful to talk to him. I really enjoyed it. He, again, like I said, he's just a kind of encyclopedia of knowledge. He's very clear. He's got a good handle on this information, and so it was a real delight to get all of his information on the podcast and just learn a lot from him. As usual, you can find this podcast at convergingdialogues.substack.com, where you can subscribe there and listen to this episode and all other episodes. And I bring you David Marchick. I'm here with David Marchick. David, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I'm looking forward to speaking with you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So you have compiled, I guess you could say. Maybe you can tell me about, just real quick how this came about. But there's a book, The Peaceful Transfer of Power, Oral History of America's Presidential Transitions. And this is, I guess, abbreviated transcripts from a podcast you did. Is that right?
So, yes, I worked for about a year and a quarter with the Partnership for Public Service, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization focused on making government better, more efficient, serving the American people more effectively. And part of the partnership is something called the Center for Presidential Transition, which focuses on making transition smoother, faster, better. And I hosted a podcast called Transition Lab, where we focused on every aspect of modern presidential transitions. And we took the interviews from that podcast and wrote a book, essentially. And the book analyzes every modern presidential transition since Jimmy Carter forward. Carter was the first modern candidate to allocate resources and time to transition planning. We focused on the historic transitions, Buchanan to Lincoln and Hoover to Roosevelt. And then we did deep dives on particular issues like the appointments process, the personnel process, ethics, policymaking. And University of Virginia Press published the book, and it's kind of taken off. So it's been great. It's been a great experience. And hopefully our work has contributed to the literature and the knowledge around presidential transitions.
Yeah, no, it's great. I mean, I think a lot of people really didn't think about presidential transitions, and they definitely didn't put as much emphasis on it until really the last one. So the last transition was really the big event of sorts in a not so great way. And so then everyone was like, oh yeah, we kind of took for granted this, peaceful transfer of power. It was just kind of a given, but then people kind of had a spotlight on it, unfortunately. So it's nice to see a kind of, oral history on what that's been like and, ups and downs and things like that. So I'm sure we'll get into that bit of it as well.
Yes.
Just real quick, give us the thumbnail sketch of yourself, just your background, what you do, what's your day job, what you study, what you research, all those good things.
So I am the dean of the business school at American University. It's called the Kogard School of Business.
Nice.
And my background, I have kind of a checkered background. I would say I've worked in government for 8 years for 2 administrations, Biden and Clinton.
Nice.
I was a partner at a law firm for a number of years, Covington and Burling. And I was a senior executive at the Carlyle Group, a financial services, basically investment firm. And I kind of just fell into this role running the Center for Presidential Transition, and that led to my research interest. So basically, if you like management, if you like politics and you like history, the subject of presidential transitions is inherently interesting.
Well, I definitely like the this weird kind of thing most people don't really find interesting, but how government kind of works and how we fill it and how all the roles. And so obviously presidential transition comes in there. I'm also one of those weird people that thinks that like when everyone's got like their issue, things that get them like all like, revved up. And for me, that's like gerrymandering, which is like typically pretty boring, but I think super essential. So yeah, I'm just boring across the board. That's how I am. But
you and I can nerd out together.
Right. Okay. So let's start out by talking in terms of the book. So, I mean, you got the all-star team, right? You talked to everybody. I mean, you talked to so many, chiefs of staff. You talked to, Ken Burns wrote the foreword. I mean, you talked to so many people from different administrations. I mean, just real quick, I mean, what was that like? I mean, obviously you've been around this stuff, but just kind of sitting down, hitting record, talking about it. Like, what was that like to just do all that?
It was fun. It was interesting, intellectually stimulating, and it made me feel proud for our country, mostly that you have a group of bipartisan officials who have served at the highest levels of government, who care about the art of presidential transitions, regardless of who wins. So, it was a personal privilege to spend time with James Baker III, who was Secretary of State, Treasury Secretary, Chief of Staff to the White House. He probably is the most important unelected official of the modern era. That's what Tom Donilon, the former National Security Advisor, said.
Sure, yeah.
People like Ken Burns, who is an inspiration and a hero to me, one of the greatest artists of our time.
Yeah, he's a national treasure in my mind.
He's a national treasure. And, it made me just confirm that one person can make a difference. So we'll talk about this, but in the Trump outgoing transition, a fellow named Chris Liddell, who was the deputy chief of staff for Trump, made a difference in the smooth transition to power, or the not so smooth transition of power to Biden. But without him, it would have been a lot worse. And he did heroic work for the good of the country in a very difficult circumstance.
Yeah. I remember reading that in the book, and it was, I didn't know that. And so it was really, really nice to actually hear that. So we'll get into that. Okay. So tell us about the major pieces of a presidential transition. You mentioned that there's executive orders, budget proposals, legislation, appointees, and really, how do you fill and run a massive federal government? So just kind of give the overview of presidential transition.
So let's talk about what happens in a transition. It's a transition like no other. No business would ever run like this. You're a professor at an academic institution. Imagine at GW, where you teach, if a new president came in and all the vice presidents left, all the deans left, all the chairs of the department left, and basically they had to bring in new people.
Yeah, that's
what happens in a government.
Yeah, that's a lot. That's a lot. It'll be mayhem.
So when there's a new president, there are 4,000 political appointees a new president appoints. They need to manage a multi-trillion-dollar budget. They supervise 4 million employees. And there's also this handoff where at the strike of noon, one president leaves and the next president comes in. And it's a point of great vulnerability for our country because you have this pivot. And our adversaries know that. And they have tried to take advantage of this moment to create chaos and havoc for the United States. We can get into that, but there have been terrorism attempts during a presidential transition.
Wow.
So it takes two to tango. The outgoing president needs to cooperate with the incoming. The outgoing president, under law, has to organize the government, has to prepare briefing materials, has to facilitate security clearances, should flag for the incoming president and his or her team all the major issues that are coming down the pike. And a new president needs to be ready. And there's only 75 to 77 days in a presidential transition, the time between the election and the inauguration. And a president that does not start planning well in advance, I say spring of the election year, will fall behind and will not be able to get everything done.
Yeah, that sounds like a long time, but I think when people realize how all the positions to fill, it's not. Just I guess a footnote here. I don't remember if it's mentioned in the book. Maybe it is. It didn't. We used to have a much longer time between election and then inauguration day. It used to be in March, I think beginning of March, from November or whatever.
That's right. Franklin Roosevelt was the last president to be inaugurated before the 20th Amendment passed. He was inaugurated, I believe, March 5th of 1933. So at that moment, there was a 4-month interregnum. Now, this happened because, for example, when Lincoln was president, he was living in Springfield, Illinois, and he couldn't just get on a plane.
Right.
It took a long time to get here. Now, he, of course, took a rail car, but prior to rail cars, people would ride horses or buggies and take a long time. So after the Roosevelt transition, there was a constitutional amendment to shorten the period of time and to have inauguration on January 20th. And ever since then, it's been 75 to 77 days, depending on the clock. So the inauguration day always is January 20th, but election day is the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. And so that can change depending on the calendar.
Right. You talk about 5 major lessons starting early. So you said, spring of an election year. I didn't realize it was that. I knew it was. My estimation was like it was summerish, like maybe July, August. But spring is pretty early actually. But in one sense. But I guess when you look at all the things that have to be done, learning from predecessors, hiring the right team, and coordinating with the campaign, prioritizing selection, vetting, and training, and then outgoing and incoming administrations working together. And it seems that it's kind of like an all or nothing thing is how it kind of comes across. It's like if one of those goes wrong, all the other ones can kind of, suffer because of that. So you just chat about the 5 lessons there.
Sure. And Mac McLarty, who was chief of staff to President Clinton, Clinton was a great president in my mind. I worked for him. He was 2-term president, obviously had some problems, but got a lot done, balanced the budget. Mm-hmm. He had a very rough start. Yeah. And Mac McLarty basically says that, when he ran, it looked presumptuous for a candidate to be planning a presidential transition. Mm. And so they didn't do that much. And once they started, they were already behind. And Mac in the book says that once you fall behind, you can never catch up. Mm. So let's talk about the most important one, which is the personnel process. Okay. On January 20th, a new president should have their entire or most of their White House staff in place. Mm-hmm. Those positions do not require Senate confirmation. A president can appoint those people without any approvals. Mm-hmm. And, there's hundreds of people that work at the White House. And that takes time to recruit, to organize, to vet those people. It takes months and months and months. Then within the cabinet agencies and all the agencies around the government, there's 4,000 political positions. 1,250 of them need to be confirmed by the Senate. 1,250. That's a lot. So the best outcome that any president has ever had in the first year was George W. Bush. Hmm. He had something around 530, 540 appointees in the government at the end of the first year. That's the best ever. Wow. So the best ever has scored 40% after the first year. So, and then what happens is after the first year, people start to leave. So a president really can never catch up and never can get ahead. So starting early in personnel is the most important thing. This was a lesson from the 9/11 experience. So George W. Bush was elected in the year 2000. Mm-hmm. You recall that year we had Bush v. Gore. Yep. December is when we actually found the results, right? Exactly. It was December 12th or 13th. Right. But Bush only had a 35 or 37-day transition. Fast forward to 9/11. On that day, he only had slightly more than half of his national security team in place. Half. And half of those officials had only been in place for less than 2 months. So the 9/11 Commission, a bipartisan commission that analyzed what went wrong and what went well on 9/11, found that the shortened transition imperiled Bush's ability to get his team in place, and that imperiled our national security readiness. Wow. So that's why personnel is so important. Now, collaboration between the outgoing and incoming, let me give you an example of that. Sure. Let's take George W. Bush again. Actually, the gold standard for presidential transitions is Bush to Obama. Uh-huh. So Bush in his 7th year, he said, my transition was not perfect. We had a lot of problems. It was slow. I caught up, but it was slow. Mm-hmm. We're now at a time of 2 wars, Afghanistan and Iraq. Yeah. I want to make sure the next president has a better start. So Bush instructed his chief of staff, Josh Bolten, to basically put in place a process to roll out the red carpet for whomever the next president was, Republican or Democrat. Mm-hmm. So Josh organized the government into committees. He required briefing memos. He started working simultaneously during the summer of 2008 with both Obama and John McCain. Bush was supporting McCain as a Republican, right, but he gave equal time and equal treatment to Obama. That turned out to be prescient because at the time when Obama became president, we were not only in the midst of 2 wars, but we also had the global financial crisis. Right. And the collaboration between the outgoing Bush administration and the incoming Obama administration was really important, not only in terms of programs like saving the auto industry, right, but more importantly, in terms of sending a signal to the American public and to the world that our government was going to work together on a nonpartisan basis to mitigate the impact of the financial crisis, and it helped Obama get a running start. And so George Bush gets an enormous amount of credit for creating that gold standard.
Do you think that's why, I know like towards the end and then afterwards, and then definitely afterwards with Obama when he finished, that Obama and Bush and their respective families seem to have a very good relationship outside of being president. Do you think there's anything, because, Obama, hit Bush hard. I mean, it's kind of fair game for in politics, it's kind of, hit him hard on the economy and all these things. But it seemed that at the end, of both their terms, they seemed to be, not just amiable, kind of, friendly and very, very nice. Do you think there's something to do with that, of how they helped each other at the end?
I think that Obama was, my understanding from talking to people like Dennis McDonough and John Podesta, who were chiefs of staff for Obama, and then Podesta ran the transition for him, that Obama was grateful for Bush's grace, cooperation, and collaboration. And you hit it right. Obama basically ran his entire campaign against Bush. Bush was deeply unpopular. In fact, on the podcast, I said, geez, Josh Bolton, wasn't it hard for Bush to collaborate with Obama when Obama was just kicking the crap out of Bush every day? And Josh, who has a wonderful sense of humor, said, actually, Bush was so unpopular at the end of his term that both McCain and Obama ran against Bush. So it was equal opportunity criticism.
Yeah. So real quick, before we get to some of the historical stuff, you talk about different parts in the book. You mentioned some things that people may not know, but I think it's a little bit important to elaborate here. You talk about the Office of Presidential Personnel, why that's essential, chief of staff, things like that. You also talk about the General Service Administration. So what are these kinds of, big offices and administrations that help kind of coordinate within the transition process?
Okay, great question. Because I live in Washington, I've been around government, and I just think this is kind of inherent. But let's talk to your listeners who may not be as familiar. Presidential Personnel is an office within the White House that handles the selection, vetting, prioritization of all personnel. It's typically all political appointees. And it's typically, they have somewhere between 50 and 100 people. And that group gets bigger during transitions and smaller in the second, third, and fourth year. But basically, they support a president in his or her selection of candidates, 4,000 candidates. So it's a huge operation. And, Obama got 500,000 resumes. A new president gets 500,000 resumes. The General Services Administration, the GSA, does a lot of logistical support for the government. Their main function is they handle all the real estate for the U.S. government and all the technology for the U.S. government. So the reason they're important for presidential transitions is that when there's a new candidate for office, and that candidate has won the Democratic or Republican convention, the law, the Presidential Transition Act, requires the GSA to give the candidate space, technology, and support so that the candidates have a secure place to work. Their teams have a secure place to work. They have access to government technology so they can have a secure technology infrastructure and ecosystem. And the GSA coordinates the activities of the entire government to prepare for the presidential transition. So these are two parts of the government that are not that well known that play a very, very important role in preparing and ensuring that there's a smooth and peaceful transition of power. Yeah. I feel like many people, if they haven't looked into this, and most people probably wouldn't, right? It's just kind of this, bureaucratic government kind of stuff, but it's really important of understanding all of those parts that are happening. I feel like some people just think that, it's, whomever the incoming president is, he just has his friends and, associates and people that worked on the campaign, and you just kind of feel it and stuff happens. But it's like a whole big
full-time job trying to do all this stuff. I mean, granted, that does happen. Some people from the campaign do go and work with the administration, but so you mentioned it earlier about some of the national security stuff, which I also didn't really initially think about. And then when I was reading it in the book, I said, oh yeah, that is a very, very, very vulnerable time. How does that work when, there's the president-elect and then there's the president, the current president that's, outgoing, and they're both getting the same, national security briefings. Like, there's only one president at one time, right? There's not two presidents. But how does that work? That has to be a very difficult task.
So again, a great question. Think about this in phases.
Mm-hmm.
Post-convention, pre-election, the intelligence community has the option of briefing the candidates. And they provide high-level briefings, not the same level of depth as an incoming president, as a sitting president. Typically, a candidate will receive 3, 4, 5 briefings during the campaign. Here's what's going on in X country. Here's what's going on with this issue. After the election, when there's a president-elect, the president-elect, best practice is that they should receive the same briefing as the sitting president, the president daily brief. Different outgoing presidents have treated incoming presidents differently. So I'll give you a good example and a bad example.
Sure.
President Clinton, during Bush v. Gore, this is before either Bush or Gore was named president. Obviously, Gore was the sitting vice president, so he had access to all the intelligence.
Right.
But Clinton basically said, I'm going to give George W. Bush access to the intelligence and briefings in case he wins. I don't want him to win. I want Gore to win.
Right.
But if Bush wins, I want him to be ready for the national interest. And so Clinton did the right thing. Trump, during the Trump-Biden delayed outcome of the election, or delayed acknowledgement of the outcome of the election, did not give Biden access to intelligence until, I think, early December. So it was delayed. Now, Biden is a pro. He's been in government for decades.
Sure. Yeah.
He was chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. He knew a lot of this, and he had a very experienced team around him.
Sure.
But best practice is treat it as if this person's going to be president, give them access to everything, let them start January 20th with a running start. Don't make them fall behind.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that's not surprising, unfortunately, but yeah, I mean, regardless of the kind of wealth of information that Biden and his team may come in with, or anybody, that was, each situation's different. I mean, he wasn't serving at the time. I mean, you don't want him to kind of be on the back foot on things. So let's just briefly talk about the kind of major historical transitions and then the kind of more modern stuff. Before that, you mentioned in the beginning of the book these kind of 4 aspects of presidents leading in times of crisis. And I think this is a conversation I had with Ken Burns and Jeffrey Ward. Talked about unifiers, being masters of politics, understanding history, and giving a vision of optimism and self-confidence. Why are those things important? And in that discussion you had, why those 4 kind of categories are important?
Let's go back to the Hoover and Roosevelt period.
Okay.
Time of national crisis, Great Depression, bank failures, Hitler comes to power, Japan leaves the League of Nations. All of this happened during the 4 months between Roosevelt's election and inauguration. Hoover was kind of a dour figure. He was very competent. He wasn't a great president. He was one of the worst presidents, but he was one of the most accomplished Americans ever to serve as president. He was Commerce Secretary, and then he also led international reconstruction after the war. He was a national hero. He just turned out to be a terrible president. But he had a dour, personality. And Jeff Ward, who collaborated with Ken Burns on the Roosevelt series in Civil War, Emmy Award winner, he has this great quote that says that Roosevelt's best program to get the country out of depression was his personality, his smile, his optimism, basically creating the premise that tomorrow's going to be better than today. And that optimism is very important for the way people behave. If people think that tomorrow's going to be better than today, they're going to spend more, they're going to lean in, they're going to hit the gas pedal. If they think it's going to be worse than today, they're going to hunker down, save, put money under the mattress. And, my former boss at Carlyle, Bill Conway, said, just because it's sunny one day doesn't mean it's going to be sunny tomorrow. And so there are lots of factors that go into the national psychology, and that national psychology creates confidence or lack thereof, and confidence can have a huge impact on the economy. And so therefore, this leadership, the communication, and the optimism that FDR brought in 1933 helped the country recover from the worst crisis we ever faced from an economic perspective.
Yeah, I definitely think it has to be rooted in some kind of realism, because I think you heard with President Trump, you heard that, I want people to feel good. I just want them to, I don't want it to be negative. I just, and he's kind of saying this stuff, but isn't grounded in reality a lot of the times. And so there has to be, I think, a kind of genuine, if you will, sense of optimism and self-confidence and things like that, which definitely I think Roosevelt did and many other presidents have done. So in terms of transitions, I don't know if you mentioned in the book, so if you don't want to speak on it, that's fine. What about the first transition between Washington and Adams? So, that's kind of like important, right? So he did a lot of the first. So, and that was a different time, and even how we still elected vice presidents, I think, at that time. And so, what was just kind of that, like just getting the first one kind of out the gate?
Well, there, Washington, we had gone through the American Revolution. We had a new constitution. We had a new leader. And this concept of the peaceful transition of power had not been tested.
Right.
And Washington, resigned his military commission to become president. And then he made this decision that there's no presidents for life. I'm out of here. And that established the longest record of a peaceful transition of power anywhere in the world, in democracies, which Ken Burns said is the envy of the world. And, Ken Burns also on the podcast said this was in the summer of 2020, at a time when, the country was shut down with COVID. We had racial reckoning in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder. We had 20 million people out of work. And Ken said, this is a miracle, as Reagan said. Reagan called it nothing less than a miracle. He said, for 231 years since George Washington handed the reins of power to John Adams, no troops have been alerted, no arms have been raised, no shots have been fired, and no one's died during a presidential transition. And that is a miracle. But I had Ken Burns on the podcast after January 6th. And I read his statement to him. And Ken said, I have chronicled the worst parts of American history, the Civil War, the worst parts of the Civil Rights era, history of slavery. He said, the country's never seen anything like this, where you have a sitting president who denies the outcome of an election and incites an insurrection. Those are McConnell's words, Mitch McConnell's words. So the institutions were bent, but they didn't break in 2020. And fortunately, that history, that record of peaceful transitions of power did continue on. But it was a scary moment for the country.
Yeah, I think it was, again, I think it's something we took for granted. And, we can come a little bit to it in kind of more detail, but there's the first transition, which I think was important. You've already mentioned FDR's transition in a very, very tough economic time, and World War II was kind of pending. And then there's obviously the Civil War, and the handoff between Buchanan and Lincoln was awful. It was probably one of the worst. And then you have the more recent one. But it's interesting to hear. I've heard other historians say the same thing, that when you look at the whole history of it, the handoff Biden kind of got, it was one of the worst. I mean, it was pretty terrible. Is that kind of just in having these conversations and thinking about it through history and looking at, obviously Lincoln's and FDR's and all the others, would you say that, it was one of the worst, all things considered?
So I had this debate with Ken Burns and a couple other historians. There's a couple of wonderful historians that I interviewed for the book, and Eric Rauschway, who wrote Winter's War and is an FDR expert, and Ted Widmer, who wrote a wonderful book called Lincoln on the Verge, which tracks Lincoln's train trip from Springfield, Illinois to Washington, D.C. So I debated this with him. Everybody agrees that the Buchanan to Lincoln transition was the worst. 7 states seceded. A separate president, Jefferson Davis, was elected in the South.
Right.
Half the cabinet basically defected and showed loyalty to the South. The Congress was paralyzed. Buchanan was paralyzed. And Lincoln was out in the middle of Springfield, Illinois. And it wasn't like you just get on a plane. So Ted Widmer writes this wonderful book highlighting this 13-day train trip from Springfield, Illinois through southern Ohio. It's Cincinnati to Buffalo to New York City, where the crowds kept getting bigger and bigger. 15,000 people in Springfield, Illinois was a tiny city. 25,000 people in Cincinnati. 50,000 people in Buffalo. 500,000 people in New York City, where Lincoln finds his voice and he starts to articulate some of the themes that were core to his presidency. So that was the worst transition. Then we debated, all right, what's second worst? FDR to Roosevelt? Hoover to Roosevelt or Trump to Biden? So I talked about Hoover to Roosevelt. Great Depression peaked. Hitler comes to power. Bank runs in 25 states. Japan leaves the League of Nations. All while Hoover, basically, his only thing he did was try to convince Roosevelt to abandon the New Deal. He thought Roosevelt was feeble mind and feeble body. The Trump to Biden transition took place at a time of these 4 crises: a global pandemic, huge unemployment, racial reckoning, and a political crisis. On the one hand, Biden was very, very well prepared. And his transition team anticipated most of the problems that they encountered: lack of cooperation, lack of access to the briefing materials, slowed personnel processes, et cetera. The biggest issue during the transition was COVID.
Yeah.
It was at a time when the vaccine was made and it needed to be distributed. But during the transition period, we had 172,000 Americans die. 172,000 between Election Day and Inauguration Day, where the number one issue was, how do we get this vaccine out to the American public? So, as Ken Burns said, before then, no arms had been raised, no troops had been alerted, no shots been fired, nobody died. And on January 6th, that happened. So it has to go down as either the second worst or the third worst transition in history.
Yeah, I can clearly remember, I'm sure other people remember this as well. There was, handful of articles written about it. I think there was definitely rumblings about it were we even going to have an election, right? And when people were like, we must have one. Let's find whatever we could do that would not be a good precedent to set. If we can do it during a civil war in '64, we can do it now. But it was, I think, a legitimate question that many people had. It was like, are we even going to have one? Are we even going to do this? Like, how does that, and that I mean, I'm sure that has come up at other points in history, but that not in recent modern times, I don't think. And so that to me, aside from everything else you just said, that also kind of sticks out for me as well. And then obviously you have what happened on January 6th. So let's just kind of blitz through some of the transitions that you talk about in modern times. So you said you started with Carter, and because it just kind of how it was taken seriously in kind of the modern age. I talked with Kai Bird recently. He wrote a fantastic biography on Carter. I can't remember if we talked about this, but I remember we talked about the beginnings of his presidency, and he objectively had a pretty good first 2 years, and then the second 2 years were unfortunate luck and maybe other things. But I guess what was it? I guess about his transition of. He made some missteps with appointments, not seeing White House staff as being as important as it should have been, didn't prioritize an agenda. It seems when I was reading that part and kind of some of the other stuff I've read that a lot of his kind of like temperament came through and not allowing people to kind of like do their thing and figure out what they need to do. What do you kind of make about Carter and kind of doing that?
So let's start with the positive. Jimmy Carter was an engineer. He was a planner. He was perhaps one of the smartest presidents ever to step in the Oval Office in terms of raw intellect. He gets credit for being the first modern president to allocate time and resources to transition planning. He took some of his campaign funds and allocated them to hire 50 people to work on transition planning. That's positive. What's negative is he didn't tell the campaign he did this. And so about a week before the campaign, all these stories appear in the press about Carter plans to do this, he plans to do that. And the campaign workers who had been working their hearts out for 13, 15 months said, where's this stuff coming from? So I interviewed Stu Eisenstadt, who was Carter's domestic policy advisor. He went to Carter and said, where are these stories coming from? And Carter said, I didn't tell you, I have a whole transition team. And so that created a clash between the campaign workers and the transition team. The campaign workers basically said, we got you elected, we deserve the spoils of victory. And the transition team, who were mostly Washington hands, said, the campaign people, they're political hacks, they don't know what they're doing, we know what we're doing, we should run the government. And it created a fissure. And Stu Eisenstadt says that fissure compromised and hurt Carter's first year in office. Carter made a couple of other mistakes too. It was the post-Watergate era. So Nixon's chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, went to jail. And Carter basically said, I'm not doing what he did.
Right.
So he never appointed a chief of staff until his third year. That was a mistake.
Yeah.
And then in southern states, like Georgia, and also Bill Clinton made the same mistake. He was governor of Arkansas. The governor's staff is much less important than the cabinet, or at least at the time when Carter and Clinton were governors. And so they basically took their experience from their states and brought it to Washington. And in Washington, the White House staff is much more important than the agencies. The White House staff is the most important part of the government for a president. And so Carter gets a lot of credit, but also made a number of mistakes.
And I guess with Reagan, it sounds like there was aspects of, that there was some prior preparation that prevented some poor performance, things like that. How is this essential for trying to be a little bit more prepared for Reagan? And does Carter get a little bit of credit for that, as well? So
Carter definitely gets credit, and Reagan and others built on what Carter did. Reagan did something that was very smart, which is he appointed Jim Baker as chief of staff. It showed an enormous amount of confidence that Reagan brought to the job because Jim Baker had run 2 campaigns against Reagan. He ran the Ford campaign and he ran the Bush campaign, both trying to take out Reagan. One was successful and one wasn't. Reagan had enough confidence to say, even though this person ran 2 campaigns against me, he's the best person to be chief of staff. He has experience. He has been a senior official. He's very competent. and I'm going to put him in charge. And he gave Baker carte blanche to hire his own White House staff. And Baker hired a highly competent staff that was ready to go day one. And so Reagan actually set the gold standard for prioritizing the White House staff over the cabinet, getting a strong chief of staff, appointing the chief of staff early, and letting that chief of staff run. And so Reagan gets a lot of credit for that. And, every modern president kind of learns from the mistakes of the previous president, or should learn.
Sure.
In the case of Trump, did not. Clinton made some mistakes. But, that's part of the essence of the book, is to create a mechanism for future presidents and their staffs to learn from the past so they can do better in the future.
Yeah. So just a few more here. We've talked about, Bush, W. Bush and Obama really kind of setting the kind of standard. I mean, they both did really, really good jobs, between the two of them. Obama to Trump, was really good, Bush to Obama. But I guess one question I have here is about Romney. I thought that was so cool that you put that small chapter in there of like, well, wait a minute. What happens when the other side doesn't win and this whole transition team just basically says, well, that was all for nothing? I mean, it's not quite like that, but how I thought that was cool that you put in a transition team, and specifically that one as well, because I think that was a fairly run campaign and, et cetera. So just talk about like what happens. You can use the Romney example, but when the candidate doesn't get elected and what happens with all that preparation.
So Romney, of course, ran in 2012 against Obama, did not win. He was a former business executive, former consultant, very smart person. And he put together a very, very sophisticated transition planning effort, the largest one to date when he did that. It was run by a fellow named Mike Leavitt, who was the 3-time governor of Utah, also Secretary of Health and EPA Secretary. And a fellow named Chris Liddell, who also came back in the Trump era. So it's a small cadre of transition experts that kind of show up over and over again. When Romney lost, Chris Liddell basically says, I had time on my hands. I wasn't that busy. And I thought, let's take all the things we learned during our transition planning effort and document them. Document them for the good of the nation. And so they published a book basically articulating all the things that Romney did to plan for the transition. And future candidates studied that. So Hillary Clinton's team studied it. The Trump team studied it as well. Chris Christie, who ran the Trump transition in 2016, he studied it, and he talked to Mike Leavitt and Chris Liddell. And so that was a real public service that Mitt Romney, Mike Leavitt, and Chris Liddell did to document everything they did and create a template for future leaders, future candidates to draw from.
So let's just talk about the last one, or the more recent one, I should say. As you were mentioning, you were talking about Chris Liddell, and you say in the book, Chris Liddell should be viewed favorably. He tried to create order amid chaos, pushed for the faithful implementation of the Presidential Transition Act, and facilitated the exit of a president who lost the election but refused to leave. In so doing, Liddell helped preserve democracy. And I didn't know that, because obviously we heard all the stuff online and everything that was going on, and then obviously with January 6th and everything, but just how consequential was Liddell for the Trump to Biden transition, and what might things have looked like if he wasn't there trying to do his job?
So let me tell you about this fellow, Chris Liddell. Most people have never heard of him. He's a former business executive. He was CFO, Chief Financial Officer for Microsoft and General Motors. He's actually from New Zealand. He made a lot of money and was very successful in business and wanted to contribute to public policy. And so he got involved in the Romney transition and kind of got the bug. When Trump was elected, they had thrown out all the work that Chris Christie had done. And then they realized, God, we're kind of SOL here. We don't have a lot going on. And so they called Chris Liddell, and he came in and helped rescue the transition, or to the extent that one can, if you throw out a year's worth of work and you have 8 weeks to get organized. So Chris became deputy chief of staff for Trump in the White House in charge of policy, and he survived. He kept his head down. He tried to do a good job. He kept out of all the craziness in the Trump administration and just tried to do a good job. Now, people can disagree with the policies that Chris supported. In fact, I do. I don't like a lot of the policies that Trump articulated. But Chris Liddell is a good public servant that tried to do right by our country. So fast forward to 2020, when Trump is running for re-election, Chris Liddell is tapped to plan for a potential second term. And then he also is the official in the Trump White House responsible for planning for the potential exit of a president who didn't want to leave. And so in the book, I say he had the worst job in Washington. Chris kept his head down. He organized the government. He prepared the government for both a Trump win and a potential loss, and did an excellent job. The day after the election, everything Chris was doing was put on hold by Trump. Basically stopped in its tracks. And only after mid-December, when the election was certified in various states, did Trump allow the transition to go forward. And Chris became the key interlocutor between the White House and the agencies and the Biden administration, and did a very, very effective job. Now, on January 6th, Chris had flown to Miami. My family and I took our first time out of Washington since COVID happened. And we landed, and my phone is blowing up. Texts, calls, I'm going, what's going on? And one of those was from Chris Liddell. And he called me. He had just called Josh Bolton, the former Bush chief of staff. Josh reported that Chris was weeping, crying.
Wow.
This is a tough guy. Survived 4 years of Trump, CFO of 2 major companies, weeping.
Wow.
And he wanted to quit. He was so distraught at what was happening in the Capitol that he said, I have to leave. And Josh Bolton and I basically implored him, you can't leave. You have to be the one to land the plane. Plane's burning, and you have to land it for the good of the country. And he stayed.
Wow.
And he helped the Biden team access the government and facilitated the transition of power. And he gets enormous credit for that, not only for what he did, but also doing it under just unbelievably difficult circumstances. Imagine working for Trump at that time, trying to facilitate Biden's entry. Not because he liked Biden. He wanted Trump to win, but because he cared about his country more than he cared about the party.
Yeah. Wow. I didn't know that. That's very, very powerful. Yeah. Wow. The last question I have for you is, how do we make sure we have another, peaceful transfer of power, as we used to for many decades, and we don't have a repeat of what happened in the last transfer. And I guess more specifically, according to your analysis and to many others, spring of 2024 is, we got to start all this up, right? Whether, if Biden does actually run or somebody else or whatever, and exiting or getting reelected or what have you. I guess, what would you say to, the Biden administration of how to go about doing that?
Okay, so the Biden administration is filled with professionals, and I'm sure they're going to do what they should do, which is do 2 things. One is plan for a Biden win and what happens, and second is plan for a Biden loss. The candidates who were challenging Biden on the Republican side, starting in January or February, they need to start thinking about, of 2024, they need to start thinking about planning for the transition. And by February or March, they should appoint their transition head. They should allocate resources. They should give that person priorities and goals. And the people that run the transition should start to ramp up and hire. You know, by the time that Biden was elected president, he had 800 people working on his transition. 800. So it was kind of a startup on steroids.
Yeah.
That's what each Republican candidate needs to do. So around this time, 2 years ago, I was starting to talk to all the Democratic candidates, Buttigieg, Warren, Biden,
Sanders,
Klobuchar, and others, and say, you know, look, your top priority is to get elected. And if you are still standing in the primaries around February, March of next year, that's when you need to start transition planning. And Biden did that. And he gets enormous credit for that.
Yeah. Well, look, Dave, you've been very, very generous with your time and your energy. The book is called "A Peaceful Transfer of Power: Oral History of America's Presidential Transitions." I should say, I want to give credit where it's due. It's you and also Alexander Tippett and AJ Wilson. I want to give them credit; they're on here too. Where can people find the book, and where can people find yourself?
People can buy it at their local bookstore. Support independent bookstores. They can also buy it at Amazon or Barnes & Noble. And I am at the Kogard School of Business at American University. And I hope people enjoy the book. And I'm grateful for your time and interest.
This was a great conversation. I really appreciate you coming on and sharing all of these wonderful insights.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.